Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Climate Politics Globally and Locally webinar about the climate crisis. We're going to go around and do USL introductions, and I will start off. My name is Maggie Natras. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a member of United Student Leaders. I'm also affiliated with Social Justice Club at the South Whidbey High School, as well as Queer and Trans Club at that same school, and I'm also a member of the Climate Crisis Action Committee with the City of Langley. And I'll pass it over to Audrey.
Hi, I'm Audrey Gamerick. My pronouns are she, her. I'm affiliated with USL. I'm also a student board member on the South Whidbey School District Board, and I am president of the South Whidbey High School Model UN Club. And I'll pass it off to Tori.
Hi everyone, my name is Tori Green. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of USL as well as Social Justice Club at school, and I will pass it off to Sid.
Hi, I'm Sid Carver. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a member of USL and also the president of the South Whidbey High School Art Club, and I'll pass it off to Naomi.
Hi, my name's Naomi. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm affiliated with USL and ASB at the South Whidbey High School. And I'll pass it off to Derek.
Hi folks, my name is Derek Koshiko. I use he, him pronouns. I'm part of USL, E3 Washington, the South Whidbey School Board, South Whidbey Schools Foundation, and a few other organizations. And I'll pass it off to Chloe.
Hi everyone, my name is Chloe. I use she, her pronouns. I've worked with groups like Sunrise and Fridays for Future as a climate justice organizer and community activist. I'm based out of Seattle and really excited to meet with y'all today.
Awesome, thank you all. Alrighty, welcome everyone. And we are officially going to dive into the climate crisis, politics, globally and locally webinar. Alrighty, just a reminder of our webinar protocol. So if you can, have your camera on, a muted mic, especially for participants here, and then your name and pronouns in your Zoom name. I appreciate all of you who have already done that. And then also just a reminder that if there is a disturbance of any sort, which there shouldn't be, but just in case, feel free to just turn off your camera and then mute yourself and probably your computer as well. And we will deal with that and signal in the chat when everything is all clear. Alrighty, so just a reminder, this is a webinar run by United Student Leaders. We are a student-led organization who is centered around youth voice and doing what the youth members here are passionate about, making change in our society, but specifically in our community. We're focused on a range of social justice issues and specifically started around the climate crisis and fighting that, but also focus on intersectionality and basically the realm of issues, again, social justice issues that students are passionate about and things that we want to make change on. We started around the global climate strike on Whidbey Island in 2020, 2021, and that evolved due to COVID over time to online Zoom meetings and also more work overall with the climate crisis declaration that the City of Langley passed and work with the South Whidbey School District and overall pushing for change in our education. We are also focusing on many other issues, but that's just the quick summary that I will do for this event. Alrighty, so just a reminder of the past webinars that we have done. All of these are recorded and on our Zoom, or not on our Zoom, on our YouTube, so anyone can check those out. We started off with 3 rounds of the Patriarchy webinar series, then moved to the Discrimination webinar series, which finished up very recently. We're now diving into the Climate Crisis webinar series, and the intro to the climate crisis was the first one that we did. This is now the second one, the climate politics globally and locally. And then one after this, which will be on March 15th, will be dive into intersectionality in the climate crisis and why that's important. Alrighty, so why we are doing this series. First, to spread awareness about the climate crisis. I know quite a lot of people here are already involved in activism and mostly around the climate crisis, but we want to educate our community more and share out the effects the climate crisis will have on our society and on our future. And we're also sharing ways, especially in this webinar, of how we can step up and fight the climate crisis. We're also working to go beyond Whidbey Island's perception of the climate crisis and add in guest speakers and other perspectives on just how drastic and important this crisis is. We thank Chloe so much for being here today to give her perspective as well. Alrighty, so this is today's agenda. We will be going into global climate politics, as well as federal climate politics and the Green New Deal. Then we'll have a quick stint about local climate politics, and some of you are very well versed on that, and some of you are not. Then we're going to have a 5-minute break, just both for presenters and for everyone here, as well as a political alignments section and building power. Specifically, that would be the section about how you can make an impact and things you can do to take action. And then we'll be closing and going into a Q&A. And throughout this, we'll have polls and also some ways for the community to interact with presenters and ways that we can get all of you to chip in and participate and share out your ideas and what you're learning. Alrighty, before I officially move on to the webinar itself, anything that USL members would like to add or anything else that I have forgotten to talk about here? Okay, great. I have seen a general shake of heads. I'm going to pass it off then. Next slide.
All right, thanks so much for that intro, Maggie. So we're going to kick off with a little bit of an interactive activity. We're going to use what's called a Jamboard. And I just want you to think about this question. What comes to mind when you think of climate politics? You don't have to give a very lengthy answer, but I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the Jamboard. And if you open it up, you'll just kind of see this whiteboard of sorts. I can go ahead and share my screen to kind of walk you through it. So if everyone can see that, this is a Jamboard. On this left toolbar here, you'll see this like sticky note icon below this mouse icon, and you can submit your answer. And you can keep it to like a short phrase, 1 to 3 words or a whole sentence. So for example, if you're like, I think of, I don't know, the United Nations, you can type in your answer, hit save, and it sends it out to the board so that when you want to look at did I write nations, how silly. Okay, so then when you want to adjust your answer, you can double click and edit it. You can make your sticky note big or small and just kind of play around. Yes, so thank you for this person who has offered their sticky note. So yeah, you can add as many sticky notes as you'd like. You can say, rising sea levels or something. You can change the sticky note of your choice using this toolbar up here and just kind of add as many as you'd like. So take a couple of minutes to think on this, and I'd love to see y'all's responses populate as we start doing this. And please let us know if you have any questions or issues with this in the chat. If it's easier for you to submit answers in the chat, we can copy and paste them and add them to the board. Seeing a lot of good responses. Just going to read some of these out while y'all are typing. Political division often leads to inaction, corporate control, blocks to getting policy changes, adding climate issues to current legislation, the idea that climate is a political issue, debate whether or not global warming is real, our last president, the blocking of climate action by natural gas lobbyists, got nothing done, greed and power mongering, more work needed, definitely. Lots of good responses coming in. Lack of collaborative work, educating those electives who have been around a long time, definitely. State laws that preempt local laws, such as those giving rights to nature. If anyone would like to elaborate on any of these, feel free to use the chat. But yeah, these are all really great ideas happening. I think what's really interesting about seeing the variety is that there's so much opportunity for climate politics work, and it's like these ones say, like, we have a lot more work to do, but there's also, like there's so much passion around it. Like, we know that we have a lot of work to do, so why haven't we been doing anything? The boomer apathy, starting at the hyper-local level to change laws. What else? War equals climate crisis, absolutely. Awesome. Yeah, thank y'all for sharing and doing this. It seemed like y'all picked it up pretty quickly. Ooh, we got more. Greta Thunberg, the politics needed to solve climate crisis does not exist yet. Individual change is not enough. Policies and laws must change. Awesome. Bright green lies. I'm just reading off some that are in the chat as well. Yeah, and I think what's really important too about just getting everyone's, getting a sense of where everyone's at too is just making sure that, I think to everyday people or lay people, they might not always be thinking about climate change as like a global issue or why it's important to think globally instead of purely focused on individual actions or individualism. And having spaces like this and sharing ideas and brainstorming like this is a great way of connecting and being in community. Driven by youth, more caress is needed, Paris Agreement. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. All right. I think we've got a lot to work with here, so I'm excited to see what y'all can contribute and how you can participate as we keep moving. But I think this will wrap up our Jamboard section for now. We can always return to this in the future and add more ideas, but thank you all so much for adding and posting stickies. I really appreciate it. But now I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can go back to the slides and start digging into global politics. And for that, I will pass it off to Audrey.
Okay, so global politics is also known as international relations, and it's the relation between states on a regional level, which would be, I guess, NATO, or on an international level, such as the United Nations. And international relations kind of helps us connect and cooperate with other governments across the globe. Okay, so different global systems that governments and economies across the globe adopt directly contribute to the climate crisis and a rise in global temperatures. One of these systems would be capitalism. Capitalism is an economic and political system that's centered on private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit, usually with limited regulation. And just a disclaimer, this section doesn't do justice on the issues caused by capitalism, leaving out huge things like inequitable distribution of wealth. So I highly recommend looking into other areas outside of the climate crisis. Historically, modern capitalism saw its rise after the Industrial Revolution, which is the same time that we saw a rise in greenhouse gas emissions due to switching from human and animal labor over to machinery that was fueled by fossil fuels. One way capitalism contributes to the climate crisis is by fossil fuel extraction and subsidies. Over $423 billion was granted in fossil fuel subsidies yearly. So these direct subsidies go directly to corporations, which is going to encourage more extraction, because they basically feed their pockets, so they're going to want to continue drilling. And this lofty amount to protect corporations and the price of fossil fuels could be spent on other areas such as public welfare or green energy and carbon capture technology, but instead governments are putting in money to support these corporations, and that's an example of it connecting to the climate crisis. Overconsumption and materialism driven by the free market also leads to an increase in emissions and pollution. This can be seen in companies such as Amazon. The need for more production leads to an increase in product, which can be polluted, leaking into different waterways, leaking into the soil, and also requiring more energy in the form of fossil fuels. International open trade or globalization also requires more energy usage to trade over longer distances. And when there's not much regulation on what can be traded and how often, typically the main source of energy for transportation is fossil fuels. So capitalism is centered entirely around the need for fossil fuels. Militarism also connects to capitalism, but it can exist under other systems. Militarism is the desire or ideology for a country or group to maintain or extend power by strengthening armed forces. So about 2 trillion USD in 2020 was invested in the global military expenditure. So in no means is the amount of money going towards military down. And militarism is completely influencing the climate crisis, as the oil industry depends on militarism to keep on growing, because a lot of crafts and vehicles require non-renewable fuel, and the Pentagon is actually the largest industrial user of petroleum in the world. And a lot of times war is fought over oil. So that, and also military lands can also lead to deforestation, ground contamination, and habitat destruction, either in the form of a training field having to be cleared, such as in Guam, or a war zone. Climate policies and activism. Despite the reoccurring question, is it even possible to solve the climate crisis under capitalism and other such systems? There have been initiatives and policies led by organizations such as the UN to kind of alleviate the climate crisis. One of these was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was in 1992, and it established an international treaty to combat human-induced climate change. It also kind of led into the Conference of the Parties, or COP, in 1995. And the main goals of these was pretty much just to address climate change overall, and it didn't really focus that much on independent economies, which was super important. And more recently, there has been the Paris Agreement, or the Paris Climate Accords, where 196 countries signed on to decrease their carbon emissions so that the global temperature increase would stick to below 2 degrees Celsius. It was mainly more focused on 1.5 degrees Celsius, but 2 was like the max, which was reassessed later as not being as effective as it should be. And in 2017, the Trump administration actually withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but it wasn't until President Biden re-entered in 2021. And the most recent reiteration of the Conference of the Parties was COP26, which actually took place in November of last year. Some goals set at this summit were to accelerate actions that were part of the Paris Agreement, as they saw that they weren't really having as much influence as they should, and just reassessing that. Another huge part of international action taken on the climate crisis is through NGOs and non-governmental organizations such as 350.org. These organizations research certain areas such as water pollution or ground contamination and report back to policymakers on, where to assess. They also can connect activists from around the world. One of these, an example of an international movement of activists is Fridays for Future, which is a youth-led movement which was initiated by Greta Thunberg that encouraged protests across the globe. USL actually put a couple on of their own, but a recent one was, I believe, is Uproot the System in September. So really, movements like this have shown pushing for climate action in multiple locations, kind of showing unity and the need to have climate action. And lastly, I believe it was yesterday, the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was released, and there's been a lot of uproar about the results from this. Kind of one quote, I believe I saw that it was considered the brink of the earth. Like, they showed us how much this, like the Paris Agreement and COP26 are not doing enough, and we must do more. There's also disproportionate blame on like who's responsible for the climate crisis. A lot of times smaller countries such as Bhutan actually absorb more CO2 than they produce, yet they're facing more rising sea levels and glacier melting, which is affecting landslides and etc. So it is crucial to hold our government accountable for these actions that they pledged for in the Paris Agreement and at different summits. For example, the pledge to put in $100 billion in climate finance is broken. So it is important, we must hold, no matter how big of scale these organizations are, we must hold them accountable. We must hold our governments accountable.
All right, thanks for covering all that, Audrey. It's definitely such an infuriating thing to always have woken up to see the new IPCC report, to hear this level of urgency from all of these, from whenever these reports have come out year after year. Constant urgency, constant level of raising, sounding the alarm, and for such dismal action to be taken. I know it's something that has definitely torpedoed my activism, and I hope that we can continue to reach people through events like these and webinars like these to get people activated as well. So this next section, we're going to cover a little bit on federal politics, just in particular the Green New Deal, since that is one of the more popular policies or more talked about in popular culture today. So just as a general overview, the federal Green New Deal is a 10-year plan to achieve 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030. It was introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey as a joint resolution in 2018. So the key word there being a resolution, which is basically a set of goals or overarching principles. So it is not a super detailed or lengthy policy that the resolution is. So if y'all will indulge me for a bit, can I have one volunteer read the 5 points on this slide? You can unmute yourself or say in the chat that you would like to read them. That would be amazing. I won't be like a teacher and call on somebody.
Yeah, this is also specifically for community members too. This isn't a call to youth, just a heads up.
Number 1, ensure economic security for people and communities that have historically relied on fossil fuels.
Thank you, Gary. Feel free to pass it off to someone else if you'd like.
Number 2, create millions of union jobs with family-sustaining wages.
I'm going to pass it off to my friend Dick Hall.
And you are muted now, so if you want to unmute, you're welcome to.
Okay, no, it should be unmuted, I guess. Okay, number 3, prevent current and repair historic oppression to frontline and vulnerable communities. And I see Richard there. Richard Timmons, would you like to do 4?
And you are muted again.
Thank you. Secure clean air and water, a stable climate, healthy food, and access to nature.
Number 5, guarantee a job with a family-sustaining wage, labor protections, and retirement security to all.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much for reading this. Greatly appreciate it. So in kind of hearing these overall principles and values, I think it's important to note that in synthesizing all of this, that this lays out a vision for an entire societal transformation. It means that we have to change how we get and distribute our energy, how we manufacture and transport materials, how we transport people, how we build our housing and our schools. So by transforming society in this way, the Green New Deal kind of seeks to address these 3 things: the climate crisis, obviously, eliminating poverty, and reducing institutionalized oppression all at the same time. So one reason the Green New Deal aims to do all of this and address these crises simultaneously is purely a moral reason. We have a responsibility to stop these crises and ensure the health, well-being, and dignity of all people. As Audrey mentioned in her section, we have a certain responsibility as people who are living in this country that is responsible for disproportionate emissions. So what is our responsibility here? To take care of the people that we need to during these crises. Another reason the Green New Deal seeks to address all of these things at once is that transitioning to clean and safe energy would be one of the biggest undertakings that we have done or seen as a country. And doing so would just create tens of millions of jobs, as it states here. So doing this would mean that we could guarantee that everyone who wanted one of those jobs could get one, no matter their race or gender or citizenship status or incarceration record or anything else. So ensuring that everyone in our society has access to those jobs would be a huge opportunity to end institutionalized oppression in the US. So in thinking about this massive undertaking and the scope of it can be hard to conceptualize. The resolution itself does lay out some specific projects that would fall under the scope of the Green New Deal. So some of these projects include replacing or upgrading every building in the US to achieve like maximal energy efficiency, safety, and durability. So this could look like replacing all homes that are powered by fracked gas or installing solar panels on all new office buildings and facilities. You know, just thinking of all the buildings in the US is a lot of buildings. Meeting 100% of our power demand through clean, renewable, safe, and zero emissions energy sources, providing training and higher education to all people of the US with a focus on frontline communities. So it would require a lot of work naturally to accomplish those first 2 projects. And we need a lot more people with these skills to pull it off. So by ensuring people have access to learning those skills, we can help make this a reality. And lastly, another project example is honoring all treaties and agreements with Indigenous peoples. So in thinking of all the changes that need to happen to the land or specific conservation work that's needed to restore the land that we live on, it's important to follow the leadership and knowledge of the people who have been here the longest, and especially ensure that we aren't having pipelines and oil spills polluting sacred indigenous lands anymore. So all of these issues are interconnected, so it's crucial that our solutions are too. So while the federal Green New Deal resolution has not yet been passed, there are various states and cities that have taken it into their own hands to pass a citywide Green New Deal resolution of their own. So some examples of cities that have passed their own versions of citywide Green New Deals include Seattle, New York City, and Los Angeles. So each city then has the ability to set their own emissions reduction targets and timelines, and can implement policies that are unique to their own political or geographic conditions of their city. So some of these policies include like diverting waste from landfills, targets for those, requiring new building roofs to be covered in solar panels or installing green roofs. This is particularly relevant to really dense cities like New York City, where there's not a lot of land or space for these kinds of projects. Increasing access to healthy local food, creating affordable housing, and more. So I think it's also important to note that because these are city-specific Green New Deals, they aren't held to the same targets or standards as a federal Green New Deal. As an example, there's a graphic here with Los Angeles's Green New Deal plan that states that their goal is for 100% renewable energy by 2045. This is 15 years past the federal Green New Deal's goal of 2030, and it's far too late and not nearly urgent enough for the kind of climate action that we need. So I think it's safe to say these policies are not perfect, and we have a lot of room for improvement with them for sure. But I also think it's necessary to consider how we as communities, neighbors, even individuals can realize the vision of the Green New Deal in our own lives and with each other. We don't have to wait on federal action to make these changes happen, especially if you're someone with wealth and financial privilege. There are a lot of ways of using your creativity, expertise, work experience, anything like that, to divest from fossil fuels and support others to do the same. So that was a lot there. I hope that at some point y'all are able to check out the Green New Deal resolution yourself if you can. I always like to emphasize to people that the document itself is only about 13 pages long, double spaced with like 2-inch margins. So it is definitely not as lengthy or as overwhelming or intimidating as it might seem in the media. So just want to do a little check-in and do a quick poll while we are here talking about the Green New Deal. I'd love to hear from you all about what Green New Deal policies you are most excited about. I'm going to send out a poll on Zoom in a bit, but it'll give you some options to pick from. But if there's something that's not listed here that you're really excited about, please feel free to share it in the chat. So I just sent it out to you all, so feel free to pick one and let us know what you think. All right, already seeing some responses come in. I think we have almost full participation, but I think ready to close it so that y'all can see the results. Okay, I'm closing this in 3, 2, 1. All right, can everyone see those? I think it's a nice, interestingly spread out, right? Definitely, I think the highest one is a lot of interest and excitement around energy, as well as Indigenous sovereignty and racial and economic justice, as well as housing. But yeah, I think it's great to see the spread, and it's always important to recognize all of these issues are interconnected as well. So you can't necessarily select housing without the same as economic justice and whatnot. But appreciate y'all for sharing, and I'm excited to see how you will use this passion and energy in your work moving forward. So I'm going to stop sharing this poll now, and I'll pass it off to Sid, who will dive into local politics.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Local governments have a very important role to play when it comes to climate action because they have a very strong connection to the community and local knowledge that helps make effective action to combat local circumstances, since they're usually community members and have spent a lot of time in that area and community. They know the specific problems that are happening and issues and are a lot more connected those at a federal level or even a state level would be to specific areas like Whidbey Island. And so one way that climate action can be seen through local governments is with climate action plans. The main areas these plans typically target are buildings and energy, and a way that they can focus on this is with incentivizing high quality and energy efficient buildings, solar schools, I apologize, and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. Land use in urban form is another area. Transportation and fuels. Ways this can be seen is planning for transit-centered and walkable communities and public transport electrification. Another main area is consumption and materials management, so adopting waste reduction strategies, and then natural systems and community well-being. This is just one way to look at breakdown of climate action plans. They're very specifically made to fit the community's needs, so they can vary on different areas being focused on. Island County had a climate action plan, I believe was from 2010, and they released a report to see the results from 2011 to 2019. This original plan mostly focused on energy and electrification and left out a lot of other areas that needed to be focused on, and emissions in a lot of the different target places actually increased instead of decreasing. And there's a new climate action plan that was proposed in 2021, but as far as we know, it has still not been implemented. And so that is quite concerning. And then, so although they've tried to make some progress with climate action plans, it's not fully effective and definitely not what we need. We need more immediate and bold climate action to make an actual difference. And then climate emergency declarations are another great step for local governments to implement climate action, and I'll talk about that more on the next slide. So what is a climate emergency declaration? The governing body formally declares that humanity is currently faced with a climate emergency and announces that climate change is a current threat to humanity and must be dealt with immediately, and that the measures taken up to this point are not enough to limit the changes brought by it. After a climate emergency is declared, a resolution and goals will be set and followed through with to mitigate climate change in a timely manner. So over 2,071 jurisdictions in 38 countries have now declared a climate emergency, and populations covered by these jurisdictions amount to over 1 billion citizens. So this is not some small thing. This is something happening all around the world, and we want it to keep happening because this is how we're getting more climate action that needs to be implemented. And so the city of Langley has officially declared a climate emergency due to the work United Student Leaders has done and adopted their resolution. And we are currently pushing for Island County to do the same and working on a resolution to try to get approved by them similarly. So these are ways to get involved specifically in local politics. A big part of this is with elections. And so some of the main ways you can get involved with that is canvassing, phone banking, voting, petitions, running for office, and educating yourself on local politics. There's many other ways to get involved, such as volunteering and testifying for bills. There's definitely a lot of different ways, but elections make big decisions on people and also about schools and lots of things that affect the community, and so it's definitely important to stay involved in that. Activism and advocacy, joining, creating, or supporting groups committed to climate action, a great way to work with the community to show support and try to help more climate action be created. And I'll be talking about that more in depth later. And then big thing is holding local governments accountable. It's so much if people talk about climate action, talk about how important it is and what they're going to do, say it in campaigns, they support it, but they need to follow through. A lot of times with government officials, it's all talk and not the action that we need to see. And so ways to keep this accountability can be letters and phone calls, attending public forums, community meetings, or speaking events, and organizing rallies, marches, or protests to further drive your support and need for climate action to make sure that governments are listening and not ignoring this issue. Okay, and then moving on to the next slide, talking more about local politics, specifically on Whidbey Island and the whole Island County area is pretty split between Democrats and Republicans, especially Republicans around the more militarized zones. And this definitely makes it hard to get climate action passed when there's such polarization in the two parties. It's hard to come to a compromise and an agreement. And a lot of the population is white and older, which can contribute somewhat to inaction. And then local militia action on Whidbey, South Whidbey schools and others nationwide have been targeted by the 3%ers, specifically around teaching critical race theory in schools. There was a large campaign on Whidbey to replace school board members that were pushing for equity and teaching about race in any capacity. There was also a protest at the end of the school year against critical race theory, sex education, and the Black Lives Matter sign. USL and students held a counter protest at the same time that gained 360 people, counting both students and community members, showing their support for teaching history, LGBTQIA inclusive sex education, and supporting the Black Lives Matter banner. And then the 2021 election, pretty recently, the school board election had a strong win for candidates who support educating around the climate crisis. So that was very exciting to see. And we're hoping that those candidates will follow through with that. And then shoreline master plans, recently they just made a new one, I believe, and Langley and Island County have definitely acknowledged that sea level rise is happening for the first time, but aren't showing much action on preventing it, which is concerning. And so it's another area where we need to hold them accountable. You can see the problem, so do something about it. And then youth taking action. Once again, the climate emergency declaration and resolution was passed by the city of Langley because of United Student Leaders, and we're currently pushing for Island County to do the same. And the Langley Climate Crisis Action Committee was created and put in place and underway, and includes USL members. And then the next slide, talking about local effects of climate change. So one, I'm sure all of you guys have noticed, specifically this winter has been severe storms such as the bomb cyclones and atmospheric rivers. This has caused an increase in power outages, boats being pushed ashore, collapsed roofs, traffic problems, road and school closures, landslides, and more. This has caused king tides and strong winds that pushed water ashore, causing mass flooding all throughout Washington, especially near western rivers, and 38 avalanches affected the state after record-breaking rain and snow last winter, and more atmospheric rivers are set to hit Washington in 2022 as the climate crisis worsens. And so this is definitely affecting people from all throughout the state, and especially locally. And then ocean acidification. Local shellfish farms, fisheries, and restaurants will be greatly impacted due to the increased death rates of shellfish due to ocean acidification. Local carbon and nutrient pollution is one of the reasons that Puget Sound's sensitivity to the effects of acidification has increased. Shellfish and other marine organisms in Puget Sound depend on dissolved calcium to build and maintain shells and skeletons. And as seawater becomes more acidic, it contains fewer carbonate ions that are available for marine organisms. And this shift in chemistry affects the marine organisms that need this calcium. Organisms such as oysters, clams, mussels, barnacles, and plankton are being affected by this, which in turn are an important food source for salmon, seabirds, whales, and other marine animals. The availability of dissolved calcium thus affects the entire ecosystem, including humans. And specifically with the effects of salmon, salmon are a keystone species and a cultural, spiritual, and economic resource to indigenous tribes in our area. And continued population decline as a result of climate change and overfishing would be devastating. And decreasing salmon population also affects the southern resident orca whales. And so another thing is the sea level rise that poses a serious threat to our island's waterfront businesses and communities. The graphic on this was just made as a part of the recent shoreline master plan, I believe, and it shows in 2050 and 2100 the sea level rise in the Langley Marina area. And as you can see, that would be very devastating to those living on the water there. Higher temperatures affects all of us, all living organisms. One thing that is affected by this is trees. Across Washington, there's been reports of diebacks of big leaf maples, Douglas fir, western red cedar pines, western hemlock populations declining from higher temps and increased droughts. In June of 2021, as probably some of you guys remember, temperature in Seattle and across Washington reached all-time highs. Seattle was 108 degrees. From June 27th to 29th, 3 out of the 4 hottest temperatures ever recorded in Seattle occurred, and 2021 stands as the only year with more than one day hitting temperatures over 100 degrees in Seattle. This affects all of us, especially those without air conditioning and any living organism that is not suited for those rising conditions. And then smoke from wildfires along with air pollution from fossil fuels is a great health risk to all living things, and wildfires are also destroying ecosystems and infrastructure. There's so much more effects of climate change besides just these direct environmental impacts. It also very much impacts our economy and everything else, and this is not a comprehensive list of everything going on. These are just some of the main effects that specifically are related to our area, and so I definitely encourage more to look into those things. And yeah, it looks like Gary put in the chat that Dungeness crab are also being studied with some of these things, and some people are leaving soon for the State of the Union address, so hopefully you guys can catch the rest of the webinar on YouTube later. But yeah, so all of these effects and more are clearly going to impact and are already impacting so much of our population and so much of the ecosystems and wildlife and environments on our island and around the world. And the governments are not adequately addressing these issues. We need more climate action immediately and boldly to stop from these events getting catastrophic. So that's all. I'm going to go into those local effects right now, and we're going to move on to a 5-minute break. There's been a lot of information in these last 2 sections, so just a few minutes for all the viewers and presenters to have a second to decompress and think about the information you've just received. If any other speakers had anything they wanted to say, feel free, but I think we can reconvene at 6.
All right, welcome back everyone. Hope that you had a good break and able to do anything you needed to do to remain present during the rest of this presentation. So I'm gonna dive into this next section on political alignments, but first want to give credit to this group called Beyond the Choir, who helped to inform and shape this framework. They are an organization that works with other social justice organizations on messaging, communication, strategy, and mobilization. So they do a lot of great work on trainings and resources and things like that. And some of the following slides and diagrams were created by them as well as other trainers in the Sunrise Movement. So let's dig in. So we know, and we've been talking about through these slides, that are going to need massive government action to address the climate crisis, and it needs to happen over a long period of time. You know, we're talking in the span of generations, but we haven't yet been able to achieve this scale of government action. And one reason or one idea or theory around it is because it is not currently part of our political common sense. Common sense is a weird idea in general, just because it means something different to every person. So what is common sense to an environmentalist like me might not be the same common sense to a person who doesn't care as much about the environment. So rather than using common sense or political common sense in its entirety, I'll be using the term political alignment, but some people have called it political realignment and other things. But when we apply this idea of political alignment or political common sense, to our current politics. We see this in our elected officials all having different ideas of what policies seem obvious to pass, while others totally disagree. And this is especially true for issues like climate action, reproductive rights, racial justice, or even the COVID-19 response. People elected are just cannot get to the same point about what seems common sense to pass, what legislation seems common sense to pass. So to better clarify political alignments, in essence, they are social and political forces that align around a shared agenda for society. And as a result, this moves society toward a shared vision of what government should do and who it should be for. So that when we have what's called a dominant political alignment, this would define the common sense of society. It would set the term for political debate. It would direct social and economic policy for as long as it remains dominant. So what you see in this diagram here is just an example of what, it's just an example of what these like social and political forces would look like, where you have varying different movements made up of different groups, all working together toward this shared vision for how society should be, but they're not necessarily movements toward the same thing. There is no convention that happens where every social movement in the world decides what that shared vision of society is. It is more of this shared desire that comes out of this need for wanting the world to be different than it currently is. So to get more specific about it, I'm going to walk through some historical examples of how we've seen this happen. And I'm going to kind of skim over some things just because we could talk through the entirety of American history using this lens, but we're not going to do that today. So the first example I'm going to walk through is the New Deal alignment. And this is an example of a dominant political alignment when FDR passed the original New Deal to get the US out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So this was a time period where it was politically possible to enact policies like Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. These were policies that were meant to fundamentally change society and the economy in the wake of this financial crisis. And it was able to accomplish other things like better labor practices, like weekends and minimum wages, social safety nets like Social Security, environmental regulation, farming programs, and the Federal Housing Administration. So it's the work of all of these simultaneous movements like labor unions or the civil rights movement or capitalist reformers and Southern whites all working together to advance, sometimes working together, sometimes not, but all working to advance their idea of this shared vision of how society should be, how they wanted society to look after the Great Depression. But what's important to note here is that the New Deal also left out a lot of people, and we're not trying to paint FDR as like the best president ever. And the consequent political conditions following the New Deal alignment would ultimately lead to a new political alignment that we kind of see today that is now kind of grounded in racism and economic inequality and things like that. So following the New Deal alignment emerges the Reagan alignment, which kind of turned everything around. The Reagan alignment accomplished destroying the social safety net, accelerated military spending, the war on drugs and mass incarceration, rollback of environmental policies, massive wealth inequality, and more. So some of these might sound familiar to you, like accelerated military spending or mass incarceration. These are problems that are still persistent and relevant in our society today, and especially considering that the strategy during this political alignment and sometimes today is that for those in power the strategy of those in power is to use racism to stigmatize government action for the public good. So within this political alignment follows the belief that government action should not be used for the public good. So you might hear that and be like, well, that's not really true. That's not what I believe in, or that's not what we're seeing today. And you'd be right, because we're starting to see a new political alignment emerge. And this is what is called, or what is being termed, the People's Alignment. So the People's Alignment is essentially a political alignment that believes in dignity, justice, and equality for all peoples, and believes in the inverse of what I just mentioned, believes in strong government action to protect the common good. So you'll see there's a bunch of movements in these like colored circles, ranging from climate advocates, movements for racial justice and equity, workers, sustainable business, and new economy. So when thinking about like what you're observing in the world right now, what issues people are really caring about, how people and organizations have emerged out of these varying crises like COVID or climate or racial justice, we are seeing in live time this desire for change across the board, across these different industries, across workers, across business, across so many different sectors. So I think it's really beautiful to see how all of these movements are coalescing around this idea, right, of wanting society to be grounded in these dignified and just values and use government action for the common good. So I think it's important to consider like our role or our place as, you know, climate advocates or environmental activists, how it fits into this bigger picture, how it's necessary to be in alignment or be in coalitional work or movement work with all these other groups, because we are all working toward the same vision of society that we want. So whether you're thinking of like, if you have a hard time thinking of like how labor union work relates to climate justice, or how, I don't know, like immigrant justice plays a role, I think this is a great way of viewing it and thinking about it. So I think there's a really great opportunity for our society moving forward for this new alignment to gain dominance, because we are seeing, again, in live time, so many people, so many movements, so many groups are wanting something different and wanting something better. So with that, I want to pass it off to Tori to talk about building power, knowing that we have all this beautiful work ahead of us all together.
Thank you so much, Chloe. That was amazing. Yeah, so this is our last section of this webinar. It's about building power, and we're going to start off with a chat activity. So, yes, there it is. Please write your answers in the chat. I'm going to read off a few of the prompts to spark your ideas. So some of the things to consider include, when you think of building political power, what do you think of? What is the importance? Is it important? How do we do it? What are the alternatives? And I'll give us a minute to think of this, and then I'll start reading them out loud. So it looks like we have the first one, organizing. The next one is, we need to build our power to influence those in power. It's essential. If you are not at the table, you're on the menu. I'll just give one more minute or so. Federal funding is important so that money doesn't equal outcomes. Grassroots, bottom up. Alternatives, grassroots, power of choice. Very important. Organizing helps amplify individual voices. How do we do it is being modeled by USL. Alternative, change the system peacefully or violently. Awesome. These are all great answers. One last one. The technologies to save the planet has been around for decades. We need people to run for office. Consider running. That's very important. And that's a perfect segue into my next slide. So first slide is personal choices and individual actions. In order to start building your power as an individual, taking part in any of these activities listed will increase your voice as an active community member who cares about the climate. So some of these things could be buying from a local business, writing a letter to a representative who is already in the power to impact the greater community, or deciding to make a change in what you eat because you care about how humanely animals are raised. I want to touch on the campaign that we participated in, which some of you probably know, Move Your Money. The premise of this campaign was to educate people about the values of their bank and make an educated choice on whether they want to stay at the bank or not. The bank that we were honing in on is Chase Bank. Chase Bank is an active investor of the fossil fuel industry, which is inevitably hurting our planet, as we all know. By moving your money from Chase Bank into a bank that is doing good, such as a local credit union, which we actually don't have one on the island, but you can like outsource off the island from like Seattle or different banks like that. So for moving your bank from Chase Bank, this will make your individual power more apparent and will essentially stop giving money to climate negative banks like Chase. When you make an action or any action, it's important to let others around you, like friends or family, know that you're doing this and why. This will create a ripple effect and be a long-term effective change for our planet. So learning about the role of individual actions can lead as a pathway to understanding larger systems at work. For example, when we think of buying more locally, this will not only support our local communities and be putting our money right back into where we live, but will also lead larger businesses to start noticing what the people want. They will get the sign that people will only support businesses and corporations doing good, then will most likely alter their business to fit the sustainable criteria to continue getting the business. So these are all ways to make your voice heard as an individual with power. Yes, and Derek also put in the chat, if you're specifically interested in the Move Your Money campaign, you can go to USL Whidbey.org, and we have tons of resources and information for you to take action in that way. So next, we're moving on to zero waste. I just wanted to give a quick explanation of what zero waste is for those of you who don't know. Essentially, the zero waste movement is a lifestyle change that has grown into a large community where individual people will live with a very minimal household. You can do this by buying things at the grocery store in only glass containers or growing your own food. You can also go to specifically bulk stores where you can purchase household items such as soap, conditioner, and many more things that have no packaging, which is the premise of zero waste. A zero waste lifestyle is one of the most impactful choices that you can make to positively affect the climate crisis. All of the energy and pollution that is emitted into the atmosphere from the making of things, the transporting of things, and the disposing of things. Along the entire pathway, it negatively affects the climate crisis. A motto for zero waste is to refuse and reuse instead of buying new. I do want to mention, though, that there are limitations that come with the lifestyle of zero waste. There are privileges when it comes to who has the financial means to purchase the more sustainable option. For example, laundry detergent in a cardboard container, which some of you may have seen at the grocery store, versus the plastic option. The plastic option will always be less of cost, which sometimes is the most feasible option when you're just trying to wash your clothes. There will also be the barriers of who has access to a bulk store, etc. It's important to note that no one size fits all. Every solution for every person will be different. Lastly, I wanted to point out that for the people who cannot afford purchasing the more expensive option are more likely not the ones who are creating the most waste. The people that have the means to spend more on these zero waste solutions are the ones creating the most waste. For example, the people in the top 10% of economic status in the wealthiest countries like the United States and big corporations. And I will be passing it off to Sid.
Hi, okay, so another important way to improve or to build your power is with community organizing, and that is something we are doing here and is a great way to build resilience, share space, and prioritize the needs of the community as a whole without depending on the actions of politicians. And so some basic steps on how to do this, it's definitely more complicated, but general outline for it is to find and do research on local issues that need attention, talk to your community, find people who know about these things and are concerned about these things to work with you, create campaigns to focus on these issues, work together with people and organize actions to call attention to or solve these issues. Actions such as protests and strikes, creating legislation to propose to governing body, as we've done with the declarations and resolutions passed by Langley, and get community support. Big parts of community organizing is discipline, making sure that you're working together and to keep community organizations running smoothly, and working on a horizontal level of helping each other out and not having a hierarchy, and especially working with youth and making sure to be adult allies for any youth involved and not letting adultism or any prejudice influence working with others. But yeah, community organizing is a great way to make change without being in a political position. And yeah, working together, power in numbers is important, and just doing what you can. And then supporting us and other organizations who are putting lots of time and effort into trying to create climate action and working on all these important issues. So yeah, definitely community organizing is a great way to build your power. And then direct action is the next thing I'm going to talk about. This is defined as economic and political acts that seek to achieve an end directly and by the most immediately effective means. Direct action often assesses power dynamics and finds a way to shift them. One of the main ways to do this is with nonviolent direct action, which can include sit-ins, strikes, civil disobedience, and counter-economics. And then violent direct action, disclaimer, we're not encouraging any violence. This is just part of direct action, and so I want to define it because that is part of this political means of creating a result, but not necessarily one we encourage. But that can include political violence, assault, arson, street blockades, sabotage, and property destruction. And then kind of an in-between type of thing is diversity of tactics, which is a strategy for mass civil disobedience in which a movement makes periodic use of force for defensive or disruptive purposes. This steps beyond the limits of nonviolence, but also stops short of full militarization. And so this is a common way as well to see results. And I'm going to give some examples of that from the next slide of how we've seen this effectively work in our society. Historically, one that all of you should probably know about is the Boston Tea Party, and then American anti-slavery movement, American civil rights movement, the suffragettes, and LGBTQIA+ and other human rights movements. All historically have used direct action to make changes in government and in society. And then more recent examples of this is the Black Lives Matter movement, the global justice movement, and some things that might not be as well known about, but are good examples of this in action was the UK Just Stop Oil campaign delivered an ultimatum to ministers calling for an immediate end to new fossil fuel investments, or they would target petrol stations, fuel deposits, and refineries. And then 4 Greenpeace activists swam 500 meters to climb onto an unmanned oil production platform operated by Total in the North Sea to protest against oil and gas exploration in Danish territorial waters. There's a picture of that. You can see the little people by their climate emergency sign. It also looks like Gary put some resources in the chat about a paper proposing that scientists go on strike. And so that's an interesting other form of direct action. And then the indigenous pipeline blockades that have been happening as pipelines continually are invested on indigenous land, which is a very negative practice. And so yeah, blockades to stop that. There's much more not covered, but just some examples of things you may or may not have heard about that are direct action, which is a way to build your power and get results from governments that aren't doing what's needed. All right, and that's the end of our content for today. And so now we've got closing and Q&A.
Yes, thank you. And I believe there's a slide after this specifically linking some of the ways you can connect to us. But basically our closing is to take what you've learned here. I know a lot of you, this is preaching to the choir, but we greatly appreciate all of your support, and we hope that you've learned something and taken something away from this. That means take that thing that you have learned and pass it along to friends, family. Again, this will be recorded and put on YouTube, so please share that. It would be very helpful for us, and also take into account some of the lenses and things that we've talked about as far as furthering your kind of knowledge around the climate crisis. Everyone here can learn something and change the way that they view their world. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to do, to expand what the Whidbey local climate action scene is and go further and dive deeper. So thank you all for being here. And a reminder that we do have a webinar that is coming up on the 15th. So I believe Tori will put that in the chat, but that is the link to register for the next one. It is specifically on intersectionality and the climate crisis. So looking even deeper into how all of these things are interconnected and how we can't solve the climate crisis without looking further into intersectionality and all of the various identities and processes and oppressions that come with that. And I think Chloe definitely touched on this here, but we will be going even more in depth in the next one. So thank you all for being here. If you have questions, please stick around. But otherwise, hopefully we will see you at the next one.